Once upon a time, in a quiet village surrounded by thick woods, there lived a little girl named Rosie. She was known far and wide for the bright red cloak she always wore, a gift from her grandmother. The villagers called her Little Red Rosie. One morning, Rosie's mother handed her a basket filled with warm bread, honey, and fresh herbs. "Rosie, your grandmother isn't feeling well," she said. "Take this basket to her, but remember, stay on the path and don't talk to strangers." Rosie nodded, eager to visit her grandmother, who lived deep in the forest. She set off, humming a tune as she walked. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the forest floor. The air was filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. As Rosie walked, she noticed the forest seemed unusually quiet. The birds were not singing, and the usual rustle of leaves seemed to have stilled. Unbeknownst to her, a cunning wolf had been watching her from the shadows. His fur was as dark as the night, and his eyes gleamed with a wicked glint. The wolf stepped out onto the path, pretending to be friendly. "Good day, little one," he said, his voice smooth and polite. "Where are you off to on this fine day?" Rosie, remembering her mother's warning, hesitated. But the wolf looked so charming and harmless that she thought it couldn't hurt to answer. "I'm going to visit my grandmother," she said. "She lives in the cottage at the edge of the forest." The wolf's grin widened. "How kind of you. But tell me, why don't you pick some flowers for your grandmother? I'm sure it would cheer her up." Rosie thought this was a good idea. She loved her grandmother dearly and wanted to bring her joy. She thanked the wolf and wandered off the path, gathering the prettiest flowers she could find. Meanwhile, the wolf, with his sly grin still in place, raced ahead to grandmother's cottage. The wolf reached the cottage quickly, his paws barely making a sound on the forest floor. He knocked on the door and, disguising his voice, called out, "It's me, Rosie." Grandmother, being very old and frail, thought it was her granddaughter and called out, "Come in, dear." The wolf entered the cottage, and before grandmother could realize her mistake, he locked her in a cupboard and disguised himself in her clothes. He then climbed into her bed, pulling the covers up to his chin, and waited. Soon enough, Rosie arrived at the cottage, her basket full of flowers. She knocked on the door and heard a strange voice say, "Come in, dear." Rosie entered and saw her grandmother lying in bed, but something felt off. The room was dim, and the figure under the covers seemed larger than usual. "Grandmother, what big ears you have!" Rosie exclaimed, taking a step closer. "All the better to hear you with, my dear," the wolf replied, trying to keep his voice sweet. "And grandmother, what big eyes you have!" Rosie said, now feeling uneasy. "All the better to see you with, my dear," the wolf answered, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "And grandmother, what big teeth you have!" Rosie finally gasped, realizing something was very wrong. "All the better to eat you with," the wolf growled, throwing off the covers and leaping towards her. But Rosie was quick-witted. She grabbed a heavy iron pan from the kitchen table and swung it with all her might. The wolf, caught off guard, stumbled backward, dazed by the blow. Rosie didn't waste a second. She unlocked the cupboard and freed her grandmother. Just as the wolf recovered and lunged again, the door burst open. The village woodcutter, who had heard the commotion while passing by, rushed in with his axe. With a single swing, he scared the wolf away. The cowardly beast, realizing he was outmatched, fled into the forest, never to be seen again. Rosie hugged her grandmother tightly, relieved that they were both safe. The woodcutter smiled and said, "You were brave, Rosie. Remember, it's always good to stay on the path. Rosie nodded, having learned her lesson. From that day on, she never strayed from the path again, and the forest remained peaceful. As for the wolf, he never dared to return, knowing that Rosie and her grandmother were not to be trifled with. And so, little Red Rosie and her grandmother lived happily ever after, with plenty of warm bread, honey, and flowers to share.